throw it in there, clip it down, throw in some B-roll, usually from the movie that we're talking about, and then ship it out. The person who's on TikTok is not the same person who is watching a long-form YouTube video. You might not get it right the first time. You might not get it right the first 10 times, but that's okay, because as long as you're learning and adapting and changing and looking at other people who are doing the same thing you're doing and trying to be like, oh, I kind of like what they did there. Maybe I'll try that in my next episode. It's all going to get better.
Hello, I'm Dustin PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Brian Condington on the PolyTools Creator Spotlight. He is a filmmaker, podcaster, video editor with Libsyn, and media professor. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Oh, thank you, Dustin, for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I saw your call on LinkedIn asking for creators, and I was like, hey, I'm one of those. I do create things every once in a while.
Well, I made this show because I really wanted to talk to people of all different backgrounds, like video game creators, podcasters, videographers, everything, because I figure everybody has a different angle. Yeah. And this particular week, I had been so caught up with my other channels that I was like, oh, I don't have a creator interview scheduled. Can anybody come on the show? So thank you for being here.
Oh, no problem.
I guess the first thing to ask is, what got you started as a content creator?
Oh, how long you got?
Longer than you, I think.
So I had always been involved in the arts to some degree. Mm-hmm. Like as a kid, I really loved, painting and drawing and sculpture and all that stuff. I always had interest in movies. For me, though, the film bug, when you talk to film people, and you talk to content creators, they always say like there's a moment that like the film bug got them, especially if they're video people. And for me, that moment was high school. I was in a TV class in high school, and it was the first time I'd ever been involved with video, and I had to make the TV, the old morning announcements, basically, for the high school that I was at. And so I just kind of saw video as this convergence of all of these different things that I was doing separately in fine arts. I loved, writing. So like I saw that, you're writing scripts and you're writing gags and you're coming up with like, different ways of being funny with these morning announcements. And I just love that sort of thing. I love the editing too. And it was a thing where I realized that this is what I wanted to do. No matter what, I wanted to be involved with video. And it just so happened that, went to school for it. Like with everyone, you have an idea of what your path is going to be. Fortunately, the country didn't really think that, as, I graduated college in the middle of the Great Recession.
Oh,
so, I mean, it's a thing where, there were no jobs. And so it's like, well, what are we going to do? And, I then went to grad school and said, well, okay, well, we'll forestall the student loans for a little bit. Still making my own things, still making videos and that sort of thing, and film, mostly short films, and, also caught the teaching bug while I was in grad school. I didn't realize I loved instructing people and teaching people how to actually do things with video. So then it was like, all right, well, there's no jobs. I was stuck in a job that I really wasn't a fan of, and it was paying the bills, and it was dealing with video, but it wasn't necessarily making movies and things like that. So that's kind of how I discovered podcasts, and the rest is kind of history.
It all just fell into place. I love the way you explained it too. Like when you make videos, it combines all three together, all the different skills you came up with. Yeah.
Because your eye is going to be looking at things in terms of the visuals that you might develop when you are doing, still lifes, and when you are looking at how light interacts with shadows and how light interacts with volume. So that all translates to cinematography. Your combination of shots being put together and juxtaposed creates kind of the story and the pacing of it. So it's a marrying of all of these different things. And I still to this day, I love it.
And even just like when you mentioned lighting, it made me think like the setup I have right now. I have my curtain slightly open so that the light could fill the room, but not too much on me. But I have my light bar by Logitech here that just helps give that illumination on the face, so that way I don't have shadows over my eyes.
Yeah, no, I have glasses and I have lights on me, and I know there's shadows on my face. But it's a thing where it's like the perfect can't be the enemy of the good in some cases.
Well, that's a good point to make too. Perfectionism is kind of the bane of a lot of creators' existence.
It is. It's absolutely a thing where, you can't. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about this, and I said that, in my head, there's always going to be the 100% But I think, especially when you're in a collaborative environment like most films are, there's going to be a point where you got to say like, okay, did we get to 90%?
Mm-hmm.
Is 90% good enough? And I am a proponent of that, as I've worked with more and more people, that there's nothing wrong with 90%. If you're getting 90% of your 100% idea, that's pretty damn good, in my opinion. It's when you get below that it's like, I don't know if we can do that. But I try really hard to get to 100%. But oftentimes when you're working with other people, you want to try to get to 90 if possible.
Like I recorded a video on my channel earlier today that has been kind of inactive. I've been focusing on this channel and my main personal brand one. So the gaming channel has been kind of like off to the side, if you will. And I decided, okay, let's make a quick little video, this kind of news kind of thing, announcement. And at the middle of the call, I guess my phone, in the middle of the video, my phone rang. I don't know, I can't speak. My phone rang, and I'm like, I'm just going to leave that in. Because like, the act of having to edit all that just at one point, just to put it into the video editor, this wouldn't be worth it just for that one little thing. I don't need to add an intro and outro. The whole point is just getting the video out on the channel. And so I just left it in, even though it's kind of disruptive a little bit. And so it's not perfect, obviously, but at least then I got it out. And that's kind of the point where a lot of creators don't get enough reps in to get the skills they need.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to creators who are like, well, I'm going to publish stuff out, but it's not perfect. And it's like, but you sitting on it is not doing anything. Now, if you're sitting on it and you're listening back to it, or you're watching it back and you're learning from it, that's something else. But, we're in a world where, our content has to go out to feed an algorithm, right? So if the content has to go out to feed an algorithm, you're not helping yourself by just sitting on it. I am a proponent of learn as you go. Okay. Yeah. Like there are, if you listen to my podcast, going back to 2016 when I started, if you listen to that first episode, it is going to be vastly different and not nearly as good as my most recent episode. And that's going to happen. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, did I know that at the time that it was not as great? Yeah, actually I did. I knew that there were problems, but I was like, I don't necessarily know what those problems are, but I know it's not 100% perfect.
You know how to fix them either.
So, I had not known necessarily everything I know now about audio that I knew then. So, I put it out though, because you have to. Because you have to, at some point, decide to pull the trigger and get the thing out there and start to grow your brand and start to grow your prominence within that niche. And you can absolutely change things. I used to work with Dave Jackson, the School of Podcasting. Great guy, hilarious, but he had so many good things to say. And he had so many great metaphors. That was one of the things I loved working with him when we did lives, is he would say things like, podcasting's a recipe. You can change things over time. And that's 100% true. You might not get it right the first time. You might not get it right the first 10 times, but that's okay, because as long as you're learning and adapting and changing and looking at other people who are doing the same thing you're doing and trying to be like, oh, I kind of like what they did there. Maybe I'll try that in my next episode. It's all going to get better.
I remember when I first started doing interviews, I was really prepared. I think I spent way too much time learning really how to do it. And it's not until you actually do it where you truly learn some lessons. It wasn't until like the 6th episode and then like 18th episode and even 100th episode where I was like, oh, I'm going to major change some things about the flow of the show, my intros. I stole a question from John Lee Dumas, I believe it was, where it's like, share something about yourself that no one knows about you. And it basically breaks the ice. It was saying I would always say it before the questions. So it was my intro. So I wouldn't tell the guest about it, which is sometimes is a curveball. But generally that curveball made it to where everything else, the rest of the show, was a lot easier. And that's kind of why I did it. But I had one guest get kind of upset about it, to the point where I was like, it's not worth doing this. I'd rather just make them comfortable in some other way or something like that. And so I got rid of it, even after doing it for over 100 episodes.
No, that's the thing, is you discovered, you're like, okay, that might work for 99% of the time, but maybe it didn't work for that 1%, but that 1% made you think like, hey, was that feeling shared amongst some of those other guests, but they did not want to say anything. That's the thing too. But I think that's an example of evolving.
And you mentioned like script writing, and you've been a podcaster for a long, long time, and you've been making a ton of YouTube videos, particularly on the Libsyn channel too. Yep. And so I like to ask people, because it's not always obvious to the viewers, what is your favorite content to make? Is it video? Is it audio? Is it written? I don't
Oh,
see you do much blogs in
that's
this sense,
hard.
but
I mean, when I got hired at Libsyn, they really didn't have a YouTube presence, and that was my primary job, and still is to grow our YouTube presence there. And so,
mhm.
taking the reins there, I worked with the people in our marketing team, and we started to kind of come up with what the ideas of our content was going to be. I had really not had a ton of experience in YouTube specifically. Making films, making shorts, those sort of things, absolutely. Not really in the YouTube realm. And that was another example of kind of learning as you go. I immersed myself in all these different YouTube channels. You've got to Think Media, Cap on. I definitely was watching their channels and watching their videos to learn that myself and really kind of adapt what they were doing and what other people were
Mhm.
doing to what we needed to do. And so I'd say, like, for me, I love any sort of content that I can educate the audience in, whether it be audio or video. And this is specifically talking about, like, we're talking about podcasting, the industry itself. I love that content because I see the return already. I'll see the comments come in. I'll see people say, hey, I love that video you did on podcast trailers, or I love that thing
Mhm.
you did showing, essential sound in Premiere Pro. I didn't know that. So, like, it's seeing the people come back and be like, you just taught me something that maybe saved me hours. So it's very gratifying to me and showing, like, that, hey, we are doing something that is having an impact on the community. Now, my other thing that I do, the Cinema Psycho show, that really began as more of a passion project. I
Yeah.
needed to find something creative to do while I had a job at the time that was not very creative at all. And it served as that creative outlet. That is where I pretty much let my hair go down, so to speak. I don't have hair, but I do. And I find that enjoyable from another side of being able to just talk about my favorite subject, which is movies, and being
Mhm.
able to analyze film in a way that is not boring and is not, just, I have nothing against film spotting at all, but it's not the most engaging type of podcast about movies. I like comedy, and I like injecting that. And if you actually watch our Libsyn videos, I start injecting comedy into them too. It's subtle, but there's definitely in there. There was a couple videos where I, threw in a thing where I think we had Elsie Escobar saying, "You don't want to sound like Darth Vader," and I threw in a shot of Darth Vader. Why? Because it's funny, right?
Yeah.
So, I like injecting humor into my content. That's just me. It's my personality, and it's whether it be education or whether it be talking about movies, it makes the content go down better, in my opinion. So, there's no favorite, but I'd say, like, just educating and entertaining are my favorite things to do.
And so really you're kind of a mix of all three, which is great. And I
Yeah.
think that that's really what the modern content creator is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you may have one you particularly enjoy, but you do all three anyways.
Yeah.
And I actually created this show because I remember on my other show, it talks about multidisciplinary people. So you have like 3 or 4 topics. Generally, they're different disciplines and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And if they're a content creator, that's one of those topics. And so I found myself talking to these people 25-30% of the conversation about content creation. I'm like, I enjoy this. I really want to dig more into this. Let's figure out how Brian ticks as a content creator.
Yeah.
What are some tricks that he knows or something like that? So I created this show to follow that passion too and get into that same detail. So I like the way you were explaining it there. I'm almost wondering like what films we would overlap on.
I mean, I love horror movies. Like, that is my jam. Now it's a thing where my podcast has been marketed, and it's not on purpose. I didn't plan on that as a horror movie podcast. It isn't.
Hmm.
Granted, we do cover about 80% of the topics are horror movies to some degree. We've gone to horror film conventions and things like that. So it's a thing where they're like, oh, Cinema Psychos, you must be
Mhm.
horror movie podcast. It's like, not really. We talk about everything. I mean, we've covered, bad movies, good movies, cult films, modern films, older films. We've covered topics that are movie centric, directors. We do kind of everything. But, like, myself and my co-host John, we are, we're horror fans first. So
Mm,
this time of the year,
that's what
October, when
shows.
we're filming this, is like our time. This is our time. We just got back from the Erie Horror Fest, in which we got to interview the director of the movie Tales from the Hood from 1995, a prolific filmmaker. His name is Rusty Cundiff, And he was amazing to talk to, because like that for me was an inspiration in my own films. Like I made narrative films and things like that. And it definitely was really cool to talk to him.
I love being able to meet some people that you see as like heroes or look up to. I got to meet Sean Cannell from Think Media and Pat Flynn earlier this year, and so some really big names in the space. And it was really nice to be able to like see these people and see how genuine they are in person too. So it's great to see like someone that like you go to that person and they're actually the same in real life as they are.
One of the first live streams that I did as part of Libsyn, where I was actually on camera, because I'd been involved in the live streams like behind the scenes more or less. But one of the first ones I did on camera was with Mike Russell. And like, for me, that was so awesome, because I literally was obsessed with his channel when I started my podcast.
Yeah.
Like I was watching every one of the Music Radio Creative or Mike Russell videos on Adobe Audition and editing. So like when I got to actually have a live with him and we were both live editing an episode, it was like Christmas morning for me. Because I was like, this is unreal. Like I never in a million years would have thought that my little podcast about movies would have led to me, one, being introduced to Libsyn, because I host my podcast with them. So I'm still a customer. Okay. And then that turned into a career, and that career then leading me to meeting people that I learned from at the birth of that podcast. So it's just bizarro.
Do you know Shannon Hernandez?
I met him. Yeah. I met him at Podcast Movement last year.
Same. That's actually what I was going for too, because literally on Thursday of the last day of the movement, I'm sitting there dying. Like I actually got like super sick. And the thing is, I'm literally on my way out and I see him from the behind. I'm like, wait a minute, I know who that is. I do a double take. Yeah. And it's Shannon. And I said hi to him, met him, and he's a super cool guy. And it was so nice to meet someone who I learned from as a budding podcaster. And did you go this year too?
I went this year too. I spoke at 2 panels. I spoke at the Black Magic panel, and then I spoke at my session on YouTube and podcast.
I think I might have been to that one then, because I'm pretty sure I remember seeing you there, because I was there this year too.
Yeah, but I met Shannon last year, and it was wild because just like you, I'd seen him on YouTube and followed a lot of his stuff. And he actually sat in my panel. And that was last year was the first time that I had been on stage for any sort of podcast conference. Like I had never gone to any of the conferences. That was the first time, the Libsyn said, hey, we want you to, speak about, editing or whatever. And so like I had done, Adobe Audition. And I was like, let's talk about it. Some things you can do in Audition. Because even though podcasters use it, it's one of those things where I don't hear a ton of people talking about it specifically for podcasting. They end up talking about things like Reaper or Hindenburg, and there's nothing wrong with those programs, or Audacity especially. But like I'm an Adobe person. That's what I use in my day to day. And I was like, let's why don't we talk about Adobe stuff? And he was in the audience, and I'm like, oh no, is he gonna call me out and say like, yeah, he's wrong about that? But he told me he loved it, and he was shaking his head the whole time, like, okay, I'm doing something good then.
Yeah, and like he's approving. That's kind of nice too.
Yeah.
Let's go back to our conversation before the call. Like when it comes to cost, like you were mentioning you're an Adobe guy. Like I used Adobe when I was in high school because I had access to it. But then after high school, it's like I can't afford the subscription.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a thing where, and I tell people this, I'm like, there's nothing wrong with Adobe. I love Adobe. It's what I learned on, and that's primarily why I use it. Is it's muscle memory for me. When you're in a professional environment, it really is true that time is kind of money. So like, yes, I could absolutely use another piece of software, but there's a learning curve with that. And it's like, well, is that going to slow me down? And why not then just use the tool that's going to get me done faster? But with people who maybe are not doing every little bit of the production of a podcast, maybe you're not doing graphics, maybe you're not doing video, maybe you're doing video, but you're doing audio, but you're not handling the graphic stuff. So you don't really need Photoshop. I mean, nowadays there's so many other tools out there that are free. Like I tell people, I'm like, if you don't want to spend the money on Adobe, that's fine. You want to do a video podcast? Great. Use DaVinci Resolve.
Yeah,
even the free version. Great. If you don't want the free version, you want to spend a little bit of money, $2.99. Boom.
Yeah.
$299, by the way, not
Yeah.
$2.99, but $2.99 one-time fee. Boom, you've got DaVinci Resolve forever. And it has a pretty powerful audio platform in there with Fairlight, and its video editing capabilities are great, and its color is fantastic.
That's what I
it's
kind of
the
like, is the
industry
color grading.
standard for a reason. So like I tell people, I'm like, you know what? Use that if you can, if money's tight. Outside of that, Canva is relatively inexpensive. You can use it for free. So there's options now that weren't necessarily in place when I started. That for me, like it's like, well, I have to use Photoshop to design my artwork, so I'm going to use Photoshop because there wasn't Canva in 2016. So there's options now than there were then.
And you mentioned Canva. They bought out Affinity Serif, which was the Affinity Photo, Affinity Designer, which is the ones I actually used instead of Photoshop. But I'm not sure how that's going to go. We're mentioning all these different tools, and I'm sure we'll get into a discussion about OBS. So besides like OBS and Adobe, what all tools do you use for creation and repurposing?
Primarily what I do use is Premiere Pro. That's my nuts and bolts thing. Since I've shifted my podcast to be more video, I'm still doing audio, and the audio will always be there. But I'm, as I've, talked to people like, Doc Rock, who, works with Ecamm, and Katie Fox of Ecamm, like they really were like pushing the video thing. And I didn't really think too much about it at the time. I was like, maybe I'll add video to it later. But like around last year, that's when I started to really be heavy on the video side. So like I edit everything in Premiere Pro. Outside of that, for Libsyn, we use Ecamm Live to do a lot of our live streams. We also use Restream to kind of do multicasting. So like those are kind of extra tools that, if you're a podcaster and you want to get started with video, you don't need them. But there's just so many tools out there now. I've played around with Opus Clip. I'm kind of particular about my clips, so I really have used Opus Clip more or less to get ideas and scan an episode, but I will still, no matter what, manually edit. It's a thing with me.
It's in your blood.
Well, it's in the blood. It's a thing where it's like, yeah, that was a cool idea, but I want to change this or that because maybe it picked the wrong camera angle for whatever reason, or I don't like, what it. So it's like I've had issues sometimes where Opus Clip finds a section that's like, yeah, this is a good section, but it gets the wrong part of the conversation, or it gets like the tail end of it. So then I have to go back. I'm like, okay, well, I'll just go and edit this myself and make it look great. So, those are kind of the primary tools. I've played around with Headliner when we used to do kind of the audiogrammed style video. I don't do that anymore just because I'm doing straight regular video. There's no real need for that. Outside of that, I've played around with AI for show notes and things like that. Claude AI is great. I actually like that more than ChatGPT. But they've they've changed a couple things around though when it comes to transcripts, where you can't really like get a full hour-long transcript anymore without it like saying, hey, you got to pay for this. So
of course,
it's always something. But with transcripts, I've actually used Mac Whisper to do a lot of the transcripts for my episodes, and I really just do that to kind of feed into the AI to then get ideas for titles and things like that. Outside of that,
what I do too is like titles. Yeah.
What was that?
Oh, sorry. Like that's what I like doing too for titles. Like titles are one of those few things where like I know I need to be really good about them, but I don't like doing them. So like I use AI.
For me, it's the show notes part. It's not necessarily the title. It is the whatever that 3 sentences description.
Meta
It's like
description.
I hate that part. I don't like doing it. The machine can do that part. The title, I used to be kind of more on the AI part, but I've actually really kind of changed my approach to titles in that I tend to now look at titles in terms of YouTube and
SEO
that's
and all that.
Yeah, so like not even necessarily SEO, but more like what is intriguing enough in the title. So yes, there's SEO keywords in there, but what in the title is going to make me, if I'm the audience for this, which I always go back to, I know who the audience is. It's pretty much me. Like I'm the archetype. What's going to make me on YouTube look at that title and go like, I think I want to know more about this. So I'll now manually craft those, but then use like AI to help like fill in the gaps for the show notes part.
I totally agree. I found myself, like, if I'm making content from scratch, I'll generally make the title myself. But if I'm using something like like an interview like here, I might use the show notes to create a title or something like that, or a transcription. I find that too, if there's like an inside joke or something like that in the video, or a particular keyword that we mentioned in the video that's like really pronounced, it's really interesting, I might use that in the title to really capture people's attention. One interview way while back, this girl came up with a new word. She combined genius with curiosity and said geniosity. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. I'll put that as part of the title. And it was just kind
But
of
you got to have other keywords with it, though.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing there, is you can't just have genius. Like, what is
Oh,
geniosity?
It was.
You got to have extra other things, because people are going to be like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't the only part of it, but the point is, like, it was that cool kind of thing. Like, oh, that's kind of interesting. What is that? What does that word mean? But yeah. And then back to Opus too. At least you could do the XML export, so you can actually bring things into.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I've only played around with it. I think I talked to someone at Opus Clip at Podcast Movie Evolutions, and they were telling me that, because I only play around with them. I don't pay for the full version because I'm just more or less testing, Yeah. So they were telling me that I guess the more information you give Opus Clip, it actually does a better job. So if I had gone out and probably paid for Opus Clip, it probably would have done a better job for me. But it's just a thing where it's like, I rather, while I'm in the edit, I'm listening back to the episode, I'm going to know what the parts are that are really going to pop. And it's just easier for me to grab that section, go into Premiere Pro, create a new timeline, and then just use the text editing feature in that to very quickly boom, boom, boom,
edit that. Yeah.
Cut this thing down. It's like Descript, but it's built inside of Premiere. So like that's what I generally do, is I'll find a section. I'm like, this sounds really good. Throw it in there, clip it down, throw in some B-roll, usually from the movie that we're talking about, and then ship it out. And there's the clip. And it's done well. I mean, we've had, shorts that have blown up to, I have one that did like 2 million views, talking about Mean Girls, the movie for earlier this year, of all things. When I've had some that have gone to like, 100,000, 200,000. I'm just like, how? Okay.
My point wasn't necessarily, I'm not trying to convince you to use Opus, although they have improved a ton. But I was just thinking too, like, I personally can't stand editing. As much as I'm pretty decent at it, like, it's not something I enjoy. I love doing the actual interviews and the research part of it. That's where, like, I love doing the research part. I get really nerdy about, like, oh, what is this? What more information can I find out about the guest to ask him a cool question, something like that. But and conversely, though, you enjoy editing. It's a good skill that you really kind of delve into. So it makes sense. Did you ever play around with those AI tools like Autopod or Firecut or something like that with Adobe?
So I it's funny you mention that. So I do use TimeBolt to do a lot of, and that's more or less, I'm using it when we making videos for the Libsyn channels. We use TimeBolt, and that helps cut down on time. Get it? But that's more or less for editing A-roll. So I don't use that necessarily for anything else other than to do that. But tools like TimeBolt, tools like Autopod, they're fantastic. I love them. I think they're great. I like the idea of AI taking away the things that are less creative. If it saves me time cutting A-roll, and I go from maybe taking 45 minutes to an hour to edit a YouTube video for A-roll only, okay, versus 5 seconds. That's go ahead, robot, have fun. Because I rather get into the, all right, let's go ahead and add what B-roll is going to really creatively tell the story. And there's nothing wrong with that. Will that get rid of jobs of the assistant editor? Probably, but sorry, at that point, maybe get a little bit better with the creative side of it. There's nothing wrong with that, but I look at it as AI is going to be here whether we like it or not. How can we use that tool to our benefit? And that's really where I think people are gonna flourish, is by seeing how can I use this tool for my own creative process.
I don't think AI is going to take so many jobs as it's going to also just change a lot of the jobs. And also too, like you said, like, people just need to adapt. The ones who are able to adapt are the ones that are going to be successful regardless of the change. Like, this happened with the internet. It happened with even like social media, and now we're seeing AI and all the jazz. So like, just learn the skills and you'll be fine.
Yeah. And it's a thing where there are going to be problems along the way. I really see that there will be issues with things like copyright. And there'll be things like differentiating between, what is the AI pulling from? Is it pulling from things that are copyrighted? Well, that's a problem. I don't care who you are. Like you're taking away from people's livelihood at that point. So, I mean, I think that is going to be an issue that's going to have to be dealt with. I see YouTube already starting that process. I think Adobe got called out with their generative AI originally when they kind of introduced it of, you're pulling stuff from other people, so you have to make sure that that's taken care of. So I think these are issues that aren't going to go away. They're just going to get bigger, and we're going to have to be confronted with how we incorporate it.
I definitely agree. There's going to be a lot of challenge there. Kind of pivoting a little bit too. I was thinking about YouTube, and they're throwing out these new features like the longer shorts, 3 minutes now, the communities tab where you can have like basically a Discord channel on your channel, and even like the hype feature too. Did you have any opinions considering that you've been working a lot with YouTube?
I mean, I don't. I love that YouTube is trying to innovate. I love that they are trying different things. I'm not entirely sure how longer shorts are going to work. And that's more or less just because of a consumption pattern that you see with people who are consuming shorts on YouTube. Okay. I think at one time, YouTube wanted to be like TikTok, and TikTok wanted to be like YouTube. And it's a real thing. Like TikTok was like, hey, we've got a lot of people on our platform. So why don't we make our TikToks longer than 25 seconds? And hey, why don't we make it so that you can do horizontal video instead of just vertical video? And yeah, we'll reward people who go onto TikTok's platform and upload things that way. And then you've got YouTube in the other corner is like, well, we've got horizontal video down pat, right? But let's add this short form stuff and let's see what happens there. And it's funny to see like this kind of false competition that's there. So I don't know how either of these things are going to work. I love the idea of communities just because that's the big thing that draws people to videos and draws people to channels is the ability to turn that watch experience into a conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is a great idea. But it also becomes like, who's moderating it? If it's like a Discord channel, if it's like a Reddit, well, okay. How is that going to be handled? Longer YouTube shorts, I think that's great. I worry though that again, the people who consume YouTube shorts who are used to getting their gratification in the first 3 seconds are not going to really then appreciate and stay for the 3-minute long short. You know what I mean? That's my concern.
I've seen situations with like TikToks where people stay for a long time, but it's generally due to like the creator being really interesting or sharing like a really interesting story. Like you have to be kind of more creative or unique to have something longer people stick around for. I feel like I remember getting the 30-minute and 60-minute updates to TikTok, and then they got rid of them within a week. And
that's because people weren't sticking around for them, and it doesn't make sense. The person who's on TikTok is not the same person who is watching a long form YouTube video. The person who's watching a long form YouTube video is going to invest a little bit more time, not a ton, but a little bit more time in that long form video. Whereas the person on TikTok and on YouTube shorts, you've got to hook them in 2 seconds. If you can't hook them in 2 seconds, they're going to the next thing. And I think there's really truth to the personality thing. I subscribe to, I think his name is Hawk on TikTok. And he always does like political videos, but I watch his stuff because I like him, the person. So like if he talks about something for 5 minutes, I'm going to watch it, And so there's something to think about of, do you do a dance video on YouTube shorts? Is that going to get people to engage? Probably not. But if you create yourself as a brand and as a character, and as an avatar for your message, then maybe you'll get people who like watching you. And that's where I think podcasts do lend themselves well to that sort of thing. But I'm curious to see how consumers of YouTube shorts are going to react to that. Because for me, I've seen it where, they'll watch it for 15 seconds and then drop off.
Yeah. I get a lot of drop off with my shorts, I feel like. But I think honestly too, my issue is like I don't have good enough hooks with my clips. I need to figure out like how to really kind of hook people better with it, either start it sooner or something like that. And kind of moving on here too, I'm curious about what you've experienced. Can you share your favorite story that's happened to you as a content creator?
Oh, geez. My favorite story. I mean, the fact that I went from producing a podcast that, again, I don't make any money from podcasts. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not going to sell you on any, premium things with my own show. Or I don't have any advertisers or anything like that. But the biggest story for me is just that I went from making this podcast for fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was just for fun. It still is just for fun. And the story of how that translated into, I was literally listening to the feed, the Libsyn podcast, every week because I wanted to learn about the podcast industry. I wanted to learn about things that were going to help my own show. And then that turning into a job at a company that I love working at. I love working at Libsyn. Every day is like it's like I really get to do this. This is the job. This is amazing. And then that job kind of turned into, okay, now we're going to have you go to the podcast industry conferences. That right there was like, whoa. So you want me speaking about these things to people and teaching them in person. I've been able to travel to, we were in DC, we were in Los Angeles, we were in Orlando for Podfest, all these different things. And I'd be like, I never would have imagined that making the decision to make that small movie podcast was going to lead to any of this stuff. That's my biggest story.
I love that. And actually, I really align with it. If you don't mind me sharing,
Sure.
I have a similar story to it too.
Yeah.
Actually, through Opus Clip, ironically. I worked for them for a time and I started doing all these interviews and I became their biggest power user back last summer. And so over the years, I made 170 interviews, and I had no way of marketing them because I spent all my time editing and posting that I was cranking them out, but I had no bandwidth to actually make the clips and do anything else. And so eventually, I started clipping them and did all that, and started posting all of them. But in that experience, I became a brand partner, and then eventually started doing a community for them, and then partnership coordinator this year up until June. And then started going to conferences and stuff like that, like a NAB and Think Media's conference. And so, again, kind of a similar trajectory there. Because of the podcast, we were able to get a job at a company that we really enjoyed.
Well, it wasn't even a thing. Like the people Libsyn didn't know that I made my podcast there. Like it was a thing where they had a job posting. I applied to it. The actual recruiter was like, yeah, there's this company. They're kind of an upstart. They're called Libsyn. I'm like, oh, I know them. They get my $20 a month for my show.
When was this?
This must have been fall of 2021.
Okay.
Yeah. So pandemic had for me at least changed a lot in my life. Like a lot of people, I was working the job that I had mentioned. I did that for 9 years. I was working in events media for a college, and I really was kind of burnt out. And I just was like, I don't want to do this anymore. But it's one of those things where you're still paying the bills. So it's like you kind of are stuck. And I think there are a lot of people who get in that position where they feel like they're stuck. And the one silver lining of the pandemic, which there's not a lot of silver linings, but I think it forced a lot of us to reassess what's important. And for me, it became reassessing what I wanted to do. And so I made the decision at the time to leave, to quit. And I quit and went into adjunct teaching. And I was adjunct teaching at another college, teaching video. And it was a struggle, but it was also like, hey, we're now doing something that we like to do. And, the adjunct teaching was great, did that for about a year, but it still was not exactly paying the bills. And so I was looking for other jobs, and the Libsyn one popped up, and I'm like, okay. Yeah, it was kismet. I think that's the word people use. That it ended up being Libsyn. I was like, okay, the universe is trying to tell me something.
Serendipity, almost in a way.
Yeah.
I find that story to be really sweet. And I think that's kind of also the point of that question too, is to hear what kind of tugs at the heartstrings, if you will. And the idea of the COVID time, the quarantine time, that's when I started doing a lot of these interviews. Actually, it's like for some reason that particular time was the time to start. I always wanted to do them, and I saw it as an opportunity. Everyone was stuck at home; you might as well do it. And I'm glad that you saw it as a positive thing too.
I saw it as I had to get out. I was like, when you're doing events, media, and there's no more events.
Well,
Like
they
literally were like, hey, yeah, there's no events anymore for a while because, I'm like, oh, okay. So what do you want me to do? Well, go home. Okay. So that was like, I got a lot of time to think.
Yeah.
But again, there's not a lot of silver lines of the pandemic. It's still, horrible. But I think it told people that, hey, you kind of have to think about what you want to do, and it might be painful. It might be not exactly the greatest situation going into it, but it's important to think about what's important to you and what you want to do every day.
Speaking of what's important, how has being a parent if impacted your creator life?
Oh, well, I started my podcast without any kids, and I wasn't married, and it was just a cat in my apartment. And it's definitely evolved. Like I'm married into a blended family where I have 3 stepsons, and then I had my daughter. And yeah, balancing all that is a lot. And like there were, it used to be that, oh yeah, I could just edit something, during the day, no big deal, or edit it after work and no big deal. But it's like, well, no, you have to make sure the kids are taken to where they need to go to for the sports or whatever activities, or, gotta drive this kid that way or make dinner and that sort of thing. So then it becomes like, okay, well, now we're editing at 10 o'clock at night or we're recording at 10 o'clock at night, and then maybe up a little bit late. So, I still struggle with that part of trying to find the balance. And I'm a night owl to begin with. So like it ends up being like, okay, well, we'll just edit this thing we'll be done at 12:30. No big deal. Put it out there so it gets out at 5 o'clock. and it's something that I'm still evolving on that front. But you kind of, roll with the punches there. I also was a thing where, before the pandemic, I was going to an office every day, and with both working at the, being an adjunct in the middle of the pandemic, and then on top of that, working for Libsyn, which is pretty much a remote company for the most part. I work from home. So it's then, well, how do you balance the working from home part with kids and that sort of thing? So it's definitely a challenge, but you get used to it and you kind of, adapt.
Work-life balance has always been a tough topic, but especially now with remote and having like a separate space for play, for work, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I have an office pretty much away from everybody, so it makes it a little bit easier. But I know people who don't, and it's like, okay, well, kids are going to run this, and like they're especially during the summertime. Summertime's one of the worst because you have kids knocking on your door, and then they're up and down, so it's fun.
I find too, like portable editing is kind of interesting. Do you ever do anything on the go, like with an iPad or whatever?
I can't stand any editing on an iPad. I can't. I'm a mouse person. I have to have a mouse, and it has to be hardwired. I don't do the wireless mouse either. Just personal. I don't like the latency issue. Yeah. But most portable thing I've done is, I've done editing for. We have a thing in Pittsburgh called the 40-Hour Film Project. I think other cities have it too. And when I've been on teams for those projects, I will edit mobily with usually a laptop. But I'm going in there, like I'll literally set up my editing station and be like, all right, as dailies are coming in, give them to me. I'll start chopping them up and, drop them into an old fashioned hard drive, not the cloud. I know. And then edit it at home afterwards. So that's about the extent of it, is kind of just using a laptop and an external hard drive because, I'm old school that way.
I grew up with computers. I actually don't like Apple very much, but I figured since you're using Ecan that you probably
Apple use both. I have both. So I have a regular Windows tower, and then I have my MacBook, and I go back and forth. I'm hardware and software agnostic when it comes to that sort of thing.
Which kind of makes it easier too. That way you can actually use more tools than most people might have.
Yeah.
Real quick before, I guess a couple more questions before we have to wrap up here. What started the Cinema Psychos show?
I had dabbled in not necessarily podcasts, but internet radio 2 years prior to the Cinema Psycho show forming. It was with a former business partner of mine. We called it Dagger Vision Horror Talk Radio. And this was internet radio. So this was not necessarily podcasting. This was me going live on the internet and him and I just talking about movies. And specifically, this was a horror thing. So
what year?
This was, this must have been, I think, probably 2013 or 14. So yeah, I don't know if those episodes are at all up there at all. I doubt it. This was strictly just internet radio. This was not podcasting. And so I had never really heard about podcasting at that time, but right around 2015, I was kind of, again, I said, like, I was working at a job that was not creative at all and making any sort of film project. I always wanted to make, a feature length film. I've still never done that. I have a script, but I've never actually made a feature film. I've done short films, music videos. I've done all sorts of things like that. But doing all of that takes a lot of time and money.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to find something that was not going to take a lot of time or money. And I was reading an article by Kevin Smith, and he was talking about Smodcast. And at the time, there were movie podcasts out there, but a lot of them were in two camps. They were either very serious, hard criticism, like film spotting, or they were like what I like to call two morons drunk in a garage talking about movies, but they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So, I was reading Kevin Smith's article about Smodcast. And Smodcast was one of the first ones to kind of be both. It was to be like both. We're going to be we're criticize it, and we're going to have film critique, but we're also going to be funny because it's Kevin Smith. And he said in the article, I'll never forget this. He said that every independent filmmaker should be making a podcast. And he said it's like, this will, in essence, build an audience for your film. Because one of the hardest things that any creative person runs into is, how do I actually get butts in seats? How do I build that audience that comes out to it? If you're not a name, if you're not someone who has a pre-established audience, how do you do that? And at the time, he said that podcasting is really that tool, that it gives you a direct line to people who have an interest that you are interested in. So I saw that. I'm like, whoa, well, maybe we can do that thing that we did with the internet radio thing, but this time make it a podcast so we don't have to be live. And maybe we can just cover all movies rather than just horror so that we make it a wider niche. Knowing what I know now, I probably would have stayed more with horror than making it a wide niche, because I discovered very early on that there's way more movie podcasts out there than especially post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. So, two friends of mine at the time, we were in grad school together. We were in our same film cohort. And I approached them both. I was like, hey, I want to do this movie podcast thing. Would you both want to come on? And they were like, yeah, we've never done a podcast, but let's do it. And the rest kind of is history from there. So, I never thought that we would be 327 episodes into this thing. I thought it was just going to be like, well, we'll see how long this goes. And it just got to be really fun. I also discovered that I was wrong about one of those points about it not being a lot of work. It is a lot of work. It doesn't cost a ton of money, and it can be done for free. But it definitely is a lot of work. It's not nearly as much as making a film, but it's a grind. That's the word I was thinking of. It's definitely a grind. But yeah, that's pretty much how the show started. And I mean, we're still going strong. We don't have a gigantic audience because, as I mentioned, I discovered that when you're in a massive niche like movie reviews, there's a bunch of people. And so, like, I have no desire to try to niche down or change formats. We're keeping it the way it is. I've resigned myself to the fact that I'm going to run out the clock on this thing. Like, my goal is to be there the longest. So, because the podcasts,
a lot of shows died out.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like, if they pod fade, well, that's fine. I'm going to still be one of those ones that are still rolling and gather new people. And it has worked. I mean, I've met filmmakers that I would never have met Had it not been for that, we've worked with podcasts that are kind of share our niche, and we've grown our viewership and listenership through that. So, I mean, it's definitely a work in progress. It's something I'm still always tweaking, still learning about how to do. But I love doing my show. It's something that, if I didn't love doing it, I wouldn't keep it up. But it's definitely evolved.
Yeah. I was going to ask how many episodes you got down. Like over 300 is a lot. I think I'm close to like 270 with my show.
Yeah.
And so I get it. It's when you're at it for that long, it's hard.
And it's a thing where like we've changed things. So like, we initially had 3 co-hosts, but 2 of my co-hosts were married and they are no longer married. So then it becomes that's a thing I wasn't expecting to have to deal with. I was like, okay, well, how do we manage that? So, I mean, like that was
alternating.
Yeah. Complicating. But I mean, I love that show. I still will always do that show. And it brings me a lot of joy to put that out. And then I see people like we started a Discord server for the podcast. And when I heard people say in the Discord server, "Oh yeah, I'm re-listening to your back catalog." I'm like, "You're re-listening? That means you've listened to it before, and now you're going back to listen to it again?"
That's sweet.
And I was like, that was just like, well, okay, well, that is validation enough. Because I think every content creator, no matter what they do, they sometimes get down on themselves and they feel like, yeah, am I really just like talking into a can that goes out to nowhere? Is anyone really paying attention? Are they getting any value over what I'm doing? And so when you get that validation back, when you get that engagement back from your audience, that is the thing that just keeps it going.
I definitely think, too, the backlog is something that a lot of people underestimate how powerful it can be. Yeah. I mean, I use my backlog for all those clips. Like, I didn't do the clips until years after I recorded some of these interviews. I still was able to do it. And on top of that, too, you were mentioning how, like, you should have niched down more, but you're more genuine when you're wide niche. Like you in particular, Brian.
Yeah.
And I also feel that way, too, with my shows. Like, being wider was more true to myself rather than trying to niche down.
It's a thing where, like, I love horror movies. Do not get me wrong. But I also love, like, mobster films. I also love action films. I love sci-fi. And it's like, I really want to pigeonhole myself into one little sliver of this thing called film. No. And, there's some movies that are easier to talk about than others. I mean, one of the things that one of the most current episodes that seems to be blowing up is we did a whole deep dive for an hour and a half long on the movie Megalopolis, which we got an advanced screening of because we, being part of being a movie podcast, it opens a little bit of a couple doors there. So, we got invited to the press screener for it. And yeah, it was really bad. I mean, I had no idea that, talking about that bad movie for about an hour and a half was going to be, kind of blow up both on YouTube and on, audio listening. So, but that's the thing where if I had been like, well, I'm just going to be a horror movie podcast, I never would have gotten invited to that. I never would have gotten the opportunity to talk about that. And then on top of that, if I talked about that movie on my podcast, it would have thrown my audience for a loop.
Yeah.
So, no, I think there's truth to that.
Well, Brian, if someone wants to find you, where can they go online to find any of your content?
Well, I mean, obviously, like if you want to learn about podcasting, please go to the Libsyn YouTube channel. That is one right there to go to. Myself, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I don't check my personal Instagram nearly as much, but my podcast one, that's probably the best one to get to. So at Cinema Psycho Show, at Cinema Psycho's Pod, I changed the name a little bit of it. Cinema Psycho's Pod on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all over the place. That's where you can find the podcast. We're on YouTube. We're on all the podcast apps too. So if you want to listen to myself and my co-host John talk about movies in, what I call vulgar humor, that's there.
I got all these kind of links down below for you, so at least people can find you that way. I just wanted to make sure I hit the verbal confirmation too. But once again, this is Brian Condington and Dustin PolyInnovator on the PolyTools Creator Spotlight. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
It was great to have you last minute too. Like, we don't have somebody.
Oh no, I
make sure to be somewhat consistent.
I love talking about this stuff. So,
me too. Cheers.